All right, Baruch Hashem. Well, thank you for joining us for our, it's the fifth class? Fifth class. All right, Baruch Hashem. And I apologize. Man, earlier in the week, I remembered that I was going to bring some quotes from my Pirates of the Caribbean, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean book. And I just thought about that a few minutes ago. I said, I totally forgot to bring that off the shelf and bring that. So, Bezrat Hashem, I will do that next week. And hopefully Hashem will remind me, and I'll be able to bring some of those discussions. So, everybody had a good week so far? You know, anybody run into any anti-Semitic situations lately? Oh, Meg? What happened?
Well, I was talking about the upcoming holidays at work, and about there was a retirement going away
Uh-huh.
to somebody, and they ordered cake, and I said, well, I'll bring a kosher cake for me.
Okay.
Anybody who wants it can share in it as well. And they're like, nobody likes your kosher cakes. I was like, kosher does not mean nasty.
Wow.
And then when I brought my kosher cakes, I didn't even get but 2 slices. They were gone.
Wow. So you had just for the people who are watching, she was having a retirement event at work, and she said she would bring her own kosher cakes, and the people said, we don't like your kosher cakes. But they ended up eating them anyway. Somebody ate your kosher cake. You only got... When I was a kid, this is a true story. It's kind of funny, though. When I was a kid, I had kids have birthday parties. And so I think this is the year, I'm not 100% sure, because I was pretty young. But my mother had made me a birthday cake, and back in those days, this is when Star Wars first came out, the original. So I don't know how old I was, but anyway, my mother had made me a R2-D2 cake. And I love birthday cake. And my mother invited a bunch of friends over. And all I remember is that I only got like one small piece of cake, and my friends ate it all these friends, you know. And my mother said that I was so upset that I didn't get more cake, that I never wanted to have a birthday party again. And she said, and so from that day forward, pretty much it was your father and myself and your brother and you, and we just went out to eat and we'd have birthday cake. Isn't that selfish? Can you believe that I did that? And to this very day, I love birthday cake, and so. But anyway, I don't know why it's doing that now. But anyway, I'm sorry about the microphone. I'll try not to bend over. Anyway, so you said you had something else, Heather. Uh-huh.
And he brought his granddaughter, who was about 11, and they're Jewish, and they're actually one of the few actually Jewish families that we have there.
Mm-hmm.
And we were discussing some things about conversion and stuff like that, and the little girl made a comment that it wasn't good to be Jewish and that non-Jewish people were cooler.
Wow. Interesting. So at the shul that they were teaching at, they had a little girl who was one of the Jewish families there, and she was expressing with a discussion about conversion that it wasn't cool to be Jewish, it was cooler to be non-Jewish. Isn't that interesting? And this is at a Messianic synagogue, no less.
I had to convince her that she was like equal.
Yeah, she had to convince her that she was equal, while she wasn't a second-class citizen. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I'm sorry. I'll have to fix that. There we go. So we'll have to work on this little microphone thing. So anyway, it is interesting. We do run in from these issues from time to time about anti-Semitism, and it's a continuing issue and continuing problem. I think I mentioned last week that the shooter in Dallas was, they said, part of a anti-Semitic group. At the time, I didn't know what, but apparently the news is that he was a part of the Nation of Islam. So the Louis Farrakhan stuff that goes on. So for what it's worth, there's an anti-Semitic thread there as well. So we are on chapter 9 in the book, and I just want to share some thoughts because we have kind of this dichotomy that starts in history. This is covering the time period from the 1600s to the middle 1800s, 1848, which is called the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment. The title of the chapter is The Age of Enlightenment and the Reaction. So this is a really interesting period of history because at this time we have a situation where people are becoming enlightened. Theocracy is starting to dwindle. Humanism is starting to dawn. Humanism has its pluses and minuses. A theocracy has its pluses and minuses. But we have a situation here where basically people are starting to figure out that we can be free, that the feudal system is not, well, it's feudal, that it's not the way things are supposed to be, that somebody can be born a slave but one day become a king, theoretically. And yet, in the midst of this, we still have anti-Semitism with respect to Jewish people. And what we don't understand, I think, sometimes is in a lot of situations, emancipation for Jews, even in free societies, did not take place until sometimes into the 20th century. And it's kind of hard for us to think that way, but there were still societies, free Western societies, where Jews were still treated literally as second-class citizens. It's interesting that even a little girl in our modern age thinks that about herself. She thinks that being a Jew is somehow less. I just find that fascinating. I don't know where that kind of stuff comes from. So what happens in the Enlightenment? John Locke, who lived in England in 1689, says, "There is no such thing as a Christian commonwealth. Neither pagan, nor Muslim, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil right of the commonwealth because of his religion." So John Locke obviously is a visionary. It's from the writings of John Locke and the theory of John Locke that we really have the United States today, that there was such an idea of liberty. And we'll get into this in a later chapter, obviously. But really, America is the only place on earth in history and even today where Jewish people have absolute freedom. And Jewish people are absolutely equal with everyone else. Going back to our founding as a country, that was the case. And in fact, Haim Solomon is credited, who was a Jewish man, who was a Jewish businessman. He's credited with financing the Continental Army. And a lot of historians give him the credit for us winning the war against the British, because the American army was basically broke, and Haim Solomon funded the army, and we were able to purchase the munitions and so on that we needed. He died a pauper, but the army, the Continental Army, went on to be able to win the war against the British because of the finances he poured in. There was also a Jewish colony. I forget the name of the island. It was in Caribbean, and it was a Dutch island. The name escapes me. Perhaps I'll look at it later. But those Jewish people on that island supplied the American Continental Army with munitions for the war. So America really owes its heritage to Judaism and to Jews. And in fact, some of you may know this already, but Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, I believe it was, their idea for the national seal was not the eagle with the clasped hands of the arrows and the clasped hand of the olive branch that we see today. We have the eagle who turns its head to the olive branch. The reason for that is because the theory of the emblem is that our eagle has the arrows in one foot and the olive branch in the other, turns its head towards the olive branch because our desire is for peace, but the image is to proclaim that we have the power to bring war, if you want it, okay? But the original idea from Thomas Jefferson was that and Benjamin Franklin was that our national seal should be a picture of the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea. That was one of the original ideas put forth as our national seal. Can you imagine that? What does that tell you about the founding fathers, by the way, and what their ideals were? So America is the only place where there's been absolute freedom for Jewish people, and it always has been, despite the fact of the U.S. grant that we talked about last week. Sorry. Okay, so Frederick II, King of Prussia. All religions, he said this in 1740, all religions are equal and good if only the people that practice them are honest people. And if Turks and heathens came and wanted to live here in this country, we would build them mosques and churches, which is an interesting, of course, this is Prussia, which is now Germany, and that's not working out so well. But this is back in a day where Islam was not insane like it is today, or at least it wasn't manifesting insane. This is kind of a theoretical question or thought I'm going to put out there. I believe in freedom of religion. I think it's important to have freedom of religion. As much as I don't like other religions, like idolatrous religions, I do think in a free society, people should be able to worship however they want to worship, unless your religion wants to kill everybody. Right? So let's just say, hypothetically, you had the religion of the widgets, and everybody bowed down to the widget, and everybody worshiped the widget, and they had widget festivals. But then the widgeteers wanted to kill everybody, and they went about their daily activity, secretly plotting to kill everybody who wasn't a widgeteer, right? It's my humble opinion, and I'm nobody, but it's my humble opinion that we should outlaw widgeteering, right? Some people might say it's against the American ideal, but to me, I look at it like a life before law. As long as your religion is peaceful, and you're going around winning congregants through peaceful persuasion, I don't think it's right. I think everybody who does that's going to end up in the Gehenna, but it's America. You can do what you want to do. But when your people go on buses and start blowing people up, that's a problem. And Japan has identified this, of all places. In Japan, did you know that Japan outlaws Islam in their country? You are not permitted to, if you're a Muslim, you are not permitted to become a Japanese citizen, and you are not permitted to have a mosque in Japan, and you are not permitted to practice Islam in Japan. Now, who can tell me the last time they heard of a terrorist attack in Japan? Yeah. I mean, it's just something to think about. I'm all for freedom. That I don't know. I don't have that idea. I don't know. I would imagine, I don't know how many Jews live in Japan. I don't know. But my theory is they probably allow it, a shul, because Jews aren't killing people. I think Japan just has a very practical idea about it. It's something to consider. Of course, that is such a politically incorrect thing to say. It'll probably never happen in America. But it's something mentioned. So in France in 1789, which is the French Revolution, which is Bastille Day, which the French people were celebrating recently when the terrorist attack happened last week, this is what it says. Men are born and always continue free and equal in respect of their rights. So the French had this idea of liberty and liberté and freedom and so on. How many of you know, again, this class is kind of like a little bit of history. I don't pretend, by the way, to be an expert in history. Please don't think that I am. I just love it. I love the topic. And I think it's good for us to learn from history. So what time I've spent I study history. How many of you know that the reason we beat the British in the Revolutionary War was because of the French, right? It's because of the French. We were actually pretty much losing the war. And then the French provided us something we desperately needed, which was a navy. This is why the South lost the Civil War, by the way. The South was pretty much winning the Civil War on the ground, at least in the East, in Virginia, which is the most important theater of war. But the South was severely outnumbered, severely outmanned, more beans and bullets were in the North. But we had far better soldiers and far better generals. and we were really defeating the Union. But we had a big problem. We didn't really have a navy. And so the Union had the Navy blockade going. And the South spent the 4 years trying to get the English to come into the war and provide us Navy support. And it never worked out for a whole host of political reasons. But had it happened, had the British done what the French did, it would have been a different history altogether. So just an interesting note. But the reason why we won the Revolutionary War against the British is because the French. And the reason the French helped us was really because they hated the British. That's really the truth. Exactly. The French always hate the British, okay? And so they always fighting the British. They've been fighting the British for years. And they saw these colonies breaking away from Britain that would weaken the British Empire. And so France said, this is good, okay? And so they came to help us. Amazing. You fight the British, I helped you, okay? Here's my navy, okay? So they came and they helped us, and it was great. We won the war. But they also, the French people looked at what happened. They looked at our Constitution, and they said, you know what? We're tired of being ruled by a king ourselves. Maybe we should adopt some of these theories. And so not too long of that, Bastille Day happened. Now, the French went about it a different way, and they started using the guillotine on the French king and queen. By the way, again, I know y'all are watching this online and going, when is he going to talk about anti-Semitism? Well, this is it. So the guillotine was considered, in its day, it was considered a, just the word escaped me, a humane death. The guillotine was invented by a doctor Guillotine. That's his last name, Guillotine. And so he invented it, and it was considered a humane way to kill someone, very quick. And I guess in theory it is. I don't know. I've never been guillotined, so I can't tell you for sure. But that was the idea. Did you know that the last person to be put on the guillotine happened in like the 1970s? I think it was 1972, but I could be wrong about that. It was in the 1970s. We think of this as an ancient practice, but it's not an ancient practice. So obviously we don't guillotine people today, but it was considered a humane way. So you have this idea in the Enlightenment period that everybody is free, and it's one of these things where theoretically it's true, but in practice it doesn't always work out that way. In the book on page 158, it talks about Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn is essentially, I don't know if the book really calls him this, but I'm going to take the liberty to say he's kind of the father of what would become Reform Judaism. In 1742, it says here, 1742, at the age of 14, Moses Mendelssohn left Dessau, and he wanted to continue his Hebrew studies in Berlin. So he says he walked the whole way. It says here's 100 miles. When he got to Berlin, that he was directed to a special gate that Jews were required to use, and it happened to be the same gate that farmers used to bring in the pigs and the cattle into the city. So that just tells you how Jews were considered in Europe. You go through the pig gate, the cattle gate. Mendelssohn was considered a genius, basically. He wanted to study Hebrew, but at the time, all the religious studies were just limited to just that, religious studies. But he wanted to study math and literature and philosophy, and all these things were considered taboo in the Jewish world. But he wanted to study these things, so he took it upon himself, it says, to learn English and French and Latin and even German. And he wanted to better himself. So he basically had this attitude that if we want to break out of these prejudices, it says here, he continued to believe that much of the prejudice would eventually disappear if young Jews combined their religious training with secular studies. That's basically the Reform philosophy. Reform Judaism has evolved over the years, but initially that's what was the point. The point was, you know what, if we just kind of drop all this separateness and we blend in with our host country, then we'll have more liberty. And that was his idea too. Of course, as we've discussed many times, it doesn't happen that way. Because there's a spiritual component. What separates Jews from, say, Muslims or, I don't know, widgeteers, is the fact that there's a spiritual component. There's a divine component there. It probably, like Texas has ruled, for instance, that, and I think Oklahoma has as well, and prayerfully, if we get a Republican president, we'll make this a national idea. And that is, there's no Sharia law within the United States. You can't have a code of law within a code of law. That doesn't work, okay? And prayerfully, that'll be the case. The election goes right. And by the way, about that, while we're praying, we should remember that it's God who chooses. So my prayer has been, please God, choose the right man. But in all seriousness, we should beseech him to choose and to forgive us of our sins so that we should not, God forbid, receive the one we deserve, but rather in his mercy, he should spare us. And we should be praying that way. So anyway, prayerfully it'll go that way, and we should have this idea. But see, Judaism is different because, for one thing, Judaism is inherently peaceful. And you can have a nation within a nation with Jews because we're not seeking to overthrow the present nation. And Jews have historically been, even though we consider ourselves a nation within other nations, we have been historically loyal to the nation in which we serve. In fact, in World War I, there were many Jews who served in the German army during World War I. Many of them did. One of them's name was Adolf Hitler. Some of you may not know that Hitler himself is Jewish by blood. Yes, he's a Jew by blood. On his mother's side, I believe, in fact. But again, remember what I told you, that a lot of the worst anti-Semites were also Jews. It's just like this precious little girl, she's anti-Semitic in her attitude, and she doesn't even realize, she doesn't even know that. But she is. She considers herself lower than non-Jews. And it's also a human endeavor or not an endeavor, excuse me, that's the wrong word. It's a human, I guess, psychology that a non-Jew would see themselves lower than a Jew. I guess this is the point of God when he says, I want my house of prayer to be a place for all people. It just so happens when you come to the house of prayer, you become Israel. But even still, it's a house of prayer for all people. I'm very proud of Sar Shalom and the fact that we are so ethnically diverse. I will tell you that was not necessarily my plan. I'm not saying that I was against it, obviously. I'm just simply saying that we didn't set out to say, oh gosh, we want to have X number of African American and we want X number of what. I was just like, we just want to be. We want to open the doors for everyone to come in and be part of the covenant. And Hashem has done this, and I just think it's incredibly awesome. We literally have so much diversity, and I think it's fantastic. And now I'm excited about it. Now when you meet people and you see they might be of a mixed marriage or something, you're like, well, man, this is the place for you. I mean, it's fantastic. I love it so much. People come from different backgrounds and different faiths. Some were like really on fire, charismatic, tongue-talking Christians, and they come. And some were from Jewish backgrounds, and some were from staunch Baptist or maybe Catholic. And it's like, this is fantastic. What a wonderful, this is the true melting pot, religiously speaking. It's wonderful. So anyway, Mendelssohn believed this. He believed that if we have these studies, secular studies, and we meld in, that people will like us. And I think it's important to note that it's not that the secular studies are bad, because many Jews have secular studies. There's many Jews who are lawyers and doctors and Indian chiefs. In fact, there's a joke about Jews, about Jewish people when they have babies. They already have a life plan for the baby. So there was a couple, they were being introduced to the synagogue, and they said, we would like to welcome and announce Mr. and Mrs. Mishon, who have had their baby boy this week. And we would like to welcome and congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Mishon and their baby boy Yaakov, Dr. Mishon. because the family, he's going to be a doctor, right? Well, obviously, if you're going to be a doctor, you got to have secular studies. I think the point is to understand that you can do those types of things necessary to better society. And being a doctor or being a lawyer or being a plumber or being an electrician or being a teacher, whatever your job is, you are actually blessing society with that. Judaism, by the way, looks at your job as that. Your job is a ministry. Whatever it is you're doing, you are ministering to society. If you're in construction, hey, look, we all need a bridge, right? We need roads to drive on. If you're a teacher, we need training. We need our children's training. If you're an electrician, we need lights put up. We need lights in the house. This is a blessing. We need a plumber. Hey, I just so happens this week I went on to turn on the sprinkler system, and I've got 2 zones that for some reason are not coming on. And I looked online, how to fix it yourself. And I'm like, oh, that's far too involved for me. I had to go find this, look at this thing. I'm like, whatever. I'm going to call the company. And they say, hey, how much can you charge to come in? I've got 2 zones. I don't know what's happening. Maybe it probably needs a solenoid. Come check it out. That's a blessing. When that person comes over, they're doing a great blessing. And that's their ministry in the world. That's wonderful. But we can also live distinct lives. We don't have to become secular in our secular world. That's the point. And if the goal is, well, if I become secular, they'll love me, they're not going to love you because it's a spiritual issue. The French philosopher Voltaire believed that Jews were ignorant and barbarous people who have long united the most sordid and detestable superstitions and the most invincible hatred for every people by whom they are tolerated and enriched. So Voltaire, he thought that the Jews were obviously a debased people, and that Jews have this hatred for people, even though they have been enriched and blessed by those host countries. This was the idea by a French philosopher. It was Voltaire who really wanted to do away with religion altogether, though. It was he who wanted to do away with the Bible and so on. He wanted to be just secularism. Secularism never works, by the way, because there's no hope in secularism. You ever notice that secular people are generally unhappy? You would be too if this is the only life you had. Sometimes I walk through life and I think, thank God there's something better than this, right? I used to have a pastor friend many, many years ago, and his favorite line was, today would be a good day for a rapture. I don't know that I believe the rapture is like Christians do, but I have used that line before just because I think it's cute and I know the meaning. The meaning is this would be a good day for Hashem to show up and just bring us into the Olam Haba, the world to come. Frederick I of Prussia, precursor to Germany, he ruled in 1669, and he had a unique idea. He was willing to grant freedom to Jews in Prussia so long as they were beneficial to him. So he appreciated wealthy Jews. So it says here, in 1669, a group of Jews who had recently been expelled from Vienna asked him for permission to settle in Berlin because the earth and the entire world, which, after all, God created for all humans, appears to be shutting us out. So their plea was written in the language of reason and common humanity. Frederick responded with a business deal. He offered the 50 richest Jews permission to live in Berlin in exchange for a payment of 2,000 thaler apiece. Now, apparently, it says here that 2,000 thaler is equal to $90,000 in today's currency. So it's like, sure, you want to settle in Berlin? Fantastic. You're a Jew? No problem. $90,000. 90 grand, you can live here. As an aside, it's interesting to me. It says here that Frederick had no interest in poor Jews. I don't want any poor Jews here. I want people who are business people. So 90 grand. And by the way, they paid $90,000. And then he said, but I want you to come here and I want you to build industry, factories and so on. Why? Well, he wants Berlin to be a wealthy city. He gets paid taxes. This is fantastic. You've already paid me $90,000, and now you're going to continue to enrich the coffers of the kingdom because you're paying taxes. This is kind of an aside, but it is interesting to know. I was looking at one time that there was a radio ad going on encouraging Americans to move to a Caribbean nation. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was like a Spanish island somewhere. Gosh, I just went blank. Can't think of the name of the island. But anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. So I was looking into that. Not that I wanted to move there. I was just curious. I says, I wonder what it means if you want to go there and live on this island. And I looked it up, and the crime rate wasn't too bad. And apparently it's a beautiful island in the Caribbean and so on. The name of it is right on the tip of my tongue. It's going to drive me crazy. But anyway, you can go there as an American, sure, and you can get citizenship, no problem, $400,000. Now, I don't know how they worked that out, if it's like a payment plan, but it's $400,000. $400,000 to become a citizen. Now, maybe you could live there and not be a citizen. I don't know, but it's one of those countries where you can just purchase your citizenship. It's very interesting. So the Jews settled in Berlin in 1969, but there's a problem. The laws were written centuries earlier, and they were determining where the Jews could live, what clothing that they could wear, what streets they could walk upon. And it says here until 1710, they also had to wear a yellow patch on their clothes to distinguish them from Germans. So you can see where Hitler got this. I've seen historical renditions. Sometimes it was just a triangle patch or just a yellow patch, and sometimes it was a star. But this is where the Nazis got it from. This was a law that was in Prussia from the 1700s. That year, he announced that any Jew who paid him 8,000 thaler could remove the yellow patch. So if you wanted to just to be able to walk around town without that yellow star or triangle or whatever it was on, you could pay 8,000 thalers. So if you do the math, 8,000 thaler would be 4 times what it cost us to live in Berlin, which would mean that you were paying the government $360,000 to not be able to not have to wear the little patch. What did Jews do that they were just poor? They couldn't afford to live in these kinds of places. Who could pay $90,000? Who here? Don't raise your hand. But who here could pay $90,000 to live in Dallas? Just to be able to buy. That's not buying a house. That's just the rights to buy a house in Dallas. Who could do that? No, I couldn't. Well, those families became gypsies. They literally became. Now, I'm not saying that all gypsies are Jews. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm simply saying they became like nomads, like gypsies. They just wandered around Europe and other places with wagons because they weren't allowed to stay anywhere. Maybe obviously some gypsies were Jews, but that's the thing. So in 1715, Frederick William sold Jews in Berlin the right to build a synagogue. Okay, so there was the first synagogue in Berlin. He required, however, that its floor be laid several feet below street level so that the synagogue would be lower than the neighborhood buildings. In 1722, he decreed that Jews could marry only if they purchased from him a certain number of wild boar. Now, why did he do this? The king knew that Jews were not permitted to eat pork, so the law was a way of showing his contempt even as he extorted money from them. It was a malicious and expensive joke at the Jews' expense. So he made Jewish people buy wild boar. And of course, what did they do with it? Who knows? But it's a completely useless item for them. They don't eat pig. And so there you go. It's just like the time where a member and myself, there was a Christian, I say it's just like this. That's obviously more egregious than what I'm about to say. But many years ago, there was a church organization, or multiple church organizations, that were going to have a prayer in the city event. This is taking place at the time in Frisco, at the stadium in Frisco, I think the ball stadium or whatever. As it turns out, it was advertised to be a multi-church prayer in the city thing. But it really turned out, which is not a bad thing, but there was a church and had been a split. And now there's two big churches that had split from each other. And this was really a reconciliation meeting. But that said, it wasn't quite what was advertised, but whatever. So we got a phone call one day, and they said, hey, we would love to have somebody come and blow the shofars at the beginning of this event. And we thought at the time, hey, okay, that sounds great, you know. So we show up at the event, me and this one gentleman, and there's two experiences, the first of which told me this is not going to turn out well. Okay. So the church, it was a church band that was an amalgamation of all the different churches. You know, the drummer was from one church and the guitar player, you know, that kind of thing. And they were playing this Michael W. Smith song that was something about Yeshua or something like that. They used Yeshua in the song, which is kind of cool. And so they told us they wanted to start the event in the stadium, this big stadium, by us blowing the shofars. Great. So he and I were going to do that together. Well, then after that, they were going to go right into this song. And the song was really great. And I was listening to the song as they were practicing one day. And I told this guy that was with me, I said, man, the shofar, like it would just go with this song. Like you could just blow the shofar in the background as the song was playing, and it would add melody to the song, and it would sound great because the song is kind of like a Jewish song. It's Michael W. Smith kind of wrote it. It sounds like that. So while the band is playing and practicing, really going on, he and I are standing off to the side, just blowing the shofar, and it was sounding so beautiful and so majestic until somebody from the event staff come over and said, hey, can y'all stop doing that because it's like disrupting what's going on here. And we were like, oh, okay. So we didn't. And I thought to myself, wow. So you just like silence. So all those other instruments like the drum, the guitar, the bass, all those are great instruments. This one is from God. All those others are from man. This one bothers you, but those you love, right? So it was just like, oh, that sounds weird. Well, then when it came time for the event, they were going to have to bring out all this sound equipment. So my friend and I, a member of the shul, I said, you know what? Let's just help them bring in sound equipment. So we were like helping offload these trucks. I mean, it was a big thing. And they said to everybody who was helping, volunteering, hey, we're going to have lunch for you guys. We're providing a box lunch. We said, fantastic. So we're helping, and we found out that the box lunch were going to be sandwiches. Okay. So we walk over to the table. I'm not kidding you. We're looking at the table, all these box lunches. They have a couple of volunteers from the various churches there. And he and I were looking at the sandwiches. We're like, well, let's see what they've got. And it was ham and cheese, 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 and ham and cheese. And I said, ma'am, do y'all happen to have anything other than ham and cheese? Because we don't eat ham like pork and stuff because of all that. So do you have like maybe like a tuna sandwich perhaps or something like to that nature? And she goes, no, it's only ham and cheese. And I was like, oh, so we're like Jewish, so when we eat ham. And she goes, oh, well, you're just SOL. Oh, my goodness. I looked at my friend, and he looked at me. And so we had made a commitment to the event that we were going to blow the shofars for that event. And we wanted to honor our commitment. So we did, and I will never forget the night of the event. We walk up, the event starts, we blow the shofars, just like we said we were going to, and we did. We step over to the side, and I sheathed my shofar in its felt bag that I still have today. And then he and I just left. We walked out the back of the stadium. What was interesting is that I recall walking out the back of the stadium, and I had my shofar slung over my shoulder, and I looked back at the band thinking, wow, what a sad event. What a sad spectacle this really is, actually. Some unknown photographer snapped this photograph of me walking up the stairs and looking back. And then it was a black and white photograph, but they took the shofar bag and they colored it, and they colored the gold in the shofar letters. And it turned out to be this amazing picture, right? And when I look at that picture, they sent it to me, some anonymous photographer. And when I look at that picture, I think, well, that was really a cool look, But I know what I was thinking when I was in that photograph, and it's an interesting reminder. But that's an example of the anti-Semitism. And these are Christian people who have invited shofar blowers to come there. And you often wonder, why did they bother to call Jewish people to come blow the shofar when that's the attitude? I don't know. Maybe it's a Frederick I kind of attitude. So I don't know. So basically, the idea in Austria and Prussia was that Jews were tolerated only in proportion to their usefulness to society. What we're talking about here can seem like it's so yesterday, like it doesn't happen. But if you actually listen to people, remember a few years ago, there was the trumped up, no pun intended, Occupy Wall Street stuff. All that was fake and phony, by the way. It was just it wasn't a real movement. I mean, and people were going there and they were getting mugged, and it was just bad. But if you listen to those people that were the Occupy Wall Street people, they were saying things like the Jews of Wall Street and the Jewish people do this and do that and so on. If you actually listen to what they were saying, they were, in a large part, were blaming the Jews for the plight of America. And what I'm trying to say is that attitude is still prevalent today. This is why there's so much anti-Semitism in the world still, even in the United Nations, about Israel and so on. A lot of propaganda. The French Revolution comes, and there's a lot that's written about here that we won't necessarily get into, but basically the French Revolution, for the most part, was good for the Jewish people. There was obviously a lot of challenges, as there is really in every time period for Jews. But basically the big thing about the French Revolution is that the idea was that you need to be French. So it's like French first, Jewish second. Which for a lot of Jews, that's perfectly fine. There's an estimate, I don't know how accurate it is, but 80% of the Jews in America are Reform. It's a high percentage. Only 20% are Orthodox, and I guess, and or conservative. Although nowadays, pardon me, for the most part, conservative synagogues are pretty much Reform synagogues. It's like Rabbi Mizrahi says. He says, in a conservative synagogue, the only one who's conservative is the rabbi. Everybody else is basically Reform. And sadly, that's kind of proved out to be the case. Most people are Reform in America. It's been my experience that, and I always say this as a caution, there's reasons why I say this. It's not to denigrate anybody. It's just because I don't know how to explain it 100%. But, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. Maybe it'll come to me as I'm talking about it. But it seems to me, in my experience over the years, that everyone who comes from a Messianic Jewish background, who's a leader in a Messianic Jewish background, they all say that they come from an Orthodox home. And that's always peculiar to me. As many of you know, I was a Civil War reenactor for a long time. And I love Civil War history. And I was never a part of any heritage groups. I wasn't really into that aspect of it. I was more into the military and the living history aspect of it, whereas some people were into heritage groups, and that's fine. I have nothing against that. But those folks tended to be, because they were more into the heritage side, whenever they dressed up in uniform to go do an event like a wreath laying or something, their uniforms were nowhere near authentic. Whereas our organization, we went to museums and painstakingly recreated our uniforms based off of what we saw in the glass, okay? But I always, when I went to the heritage events sometimes, I would always remark that everybody here is descended from an officer. So were there no enlisted people in the Army? No one ever says, my relative was Private Samuel McDuff, you know. Everybody was related from General McDuff or Captain McDuff or Lieutenant McDuff. You know what I'm saying? So it was always, not that I was trying to be cynical, but it was like, you know, why is it everybody's related to a famous general, but nobody's related to just an average Joe? So I find that to be true a little bit in the Messianic world. Because when you talk to Messianic Jewish people, leaders I'm talking about, and they say to you, I have talked to several, I grew up in a Jewish home and we were Orthodox. When you learn about their background, turns out, no, you weren't. I'll give you an example. So someone was telling me this week, they were talking to someone, and this person was a Messianic person, and they were bashing them because they belong to Sar Shalom, and we're not a legit organization because we believe that Gentiles can be converted. And I said, okay, and this person was telling me, well, this guy was saying that he's not Jewish, but his wife grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home. I said, no, she didn't. I have no idea who this lady is. I have no idea who this lady is. I have no idea. Never met her. Don't even know her name. But I was so bold to say that she did not grow up Orthodox. And he looked at me like, well, how do you know that? Are you like clairvoyant? I said, of course I am. But aside from that, how can I make such a bold statement? Because she was claiming to be from a very strict Orthodox home. I said, no, she wasn't. Nowhere even close. How do you know that? Because she married a non-Jew. She married a non-Jew. No one who grew up in such a strict Orthodox home would even consider doing that. Now, please don't misunderstand. I have, people married non-Jews and they get converted and that's all great. I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying that from an Orthodox perspective, that would have led to her ostracization from the rest of her family. She would be to them as good as dead. And that's not the case, I happen to know, in this situation, and so that's not the case. So what are they saying? She grew up in a somewhat observant home, maybe, probably more reform. But everybody wants to say they grew up in an Orthodox home because it sounds great. And everybody who's from a non-Jewish background, who hears somebody say they grew up in a Jewish home, automatically thinks that, right? And it draws them close to think, oh, you know what you're like a legit Jew. Now listen, I'm not taking anything away from people. I'm just simply saying that the reason I bring this out is because I hope it helps non-Jews not to swoon. Because then they can go, oh, okay, look, I respect your Jewish background, whatever it is. But I also think we need to be speaking in legitimate terms and let's not pretend that you wore peyot when you were growing up, because you didn't, okay? All right? It's just like it wasn't but a month or so ago, there was somebody who visited the shul here, and they claimed to be from an Orthodox background who just relatively recently believed in Yeshua. And I said, that's awesome. It's fantastic. I'm glad you're here. And, we had a great time. Invite them to Oneg, have a seat. It's great. A few days later, I got a text message from this person. Hey, how many people at your shul are real Jews? Not Gentiles playing dress up, but actual Jews. So I said, everybody is, right? Unless you're just visiting. Well, make a long story short, this is that person who said to me, by the way, why do you have separate seating for men and women in the shul? Wait a minute. You're from an Orthodox background. Is there a synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue in the world that doesn't have separate seating for men and women? Does it exist anywhere? No. If you grew up in an Orthodox synagogue and you don't know why we have separate seating for men and women, you did not grow up in an Orthodox synagogue. Maybe somebody lied to you and said they're Orthodox, but that is not Orthodox. There is not an Orthodox synagogue in the world, on the planet, that doesn't have separate seating. Now, there are some, in Dallas, in fact, that have, just like we do, men, women, and then they have like a couple seating. That's where we got the idea, frankly. visited this Orthodox synagogue in Dallas. I liked their layout. I said, hey, this works for us. I think this would be great. There's others. It's strictly men and women only with a Makitza and all that. I have no problem with that. But I think for our purposes and what we're trying to do, this works best for us. This is the best plan. But my point is, going back to this, clearly this guy wasn't raised Orthodox. Does that make him a bad person? No. I just simply want to I want to have an honest assessment of how you actually grew up. Because you can't come in and say, well, how many of you people are legitimately Jewish? You know what I mean? It's just the wrong question to be asking. And besides that, I always like to redirect those questions back to the person. Yeah, that's great. What about you? What's your observance like? Yeah, what about you? It's always, don't stop pointing at somebody else. Let's talk about us, right? It's like when you're back in the day when you're trying to talk to someone about Hashem and what he wants for people. Well, what about that guy on the desert island somewhere? Okay, I don't know about that guy, but what about you? Right now, I'm talking to you, not to the desert island guy. I'm talking to you. What's your decision? You know, when we were in Jamaica one time, there was this pastor, and we were trying to talk to him about keeping the mitzvot and so on. And of course, he had some of the same objections. And in the car one time, driving from meeting to meeting, we were shooting down his objections. And anyway, I don't recall what they centered around, but this is a line that he said, and my wife and I still use it today. So we're in the car and we're shooting down these objections. And once we got to a point where it was getting embarrassing, I simply said, you know what? Let's go back and review now what the scripture says about this topic. Now that we've destroyed all your objections, let's now go back and let's talk about what God wants us to do and why. And he says, I want to show you something. Look at the mango tree. Look how beautiful that mango tree is. So my wife and I, to this very day, whenever we're talking about something and she'll say to me, honey, I need you to go out and trim the bushes. Look at the mango tree. Look at the mango tree. You know, so that's let's stop talking about this topic and look at something else. So it's very, very funny. But anyway, so I think it's funny. This is why I encourage people, when you're out and about talking to people and they say they grew up in a Jewish home, just ask them about their home. Don't take it for granted that they grew up really in a Jewish home. It doesn't mean to be mean-spirited to them. It just means it's to say, what did that look like? And learn from it or what have you. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took power in France. It just so happens I make a lot of jokes about my French heritage, but it is funny, it is true and funny, that my great-grandfather's first name was Napoleon. I take personal humor in that. Napoleon Griffin. So anyway, Napoleon Bonaparte takes power in France, and in 1804, he proclaims himself emperor. Napoleon hated the Pope. He absolutely hated the Pope, and the Pope hated him. And when the Pope came to crown him emperor, the famous story is he grabbed the crown from the Pope and crowned himself emperor. Napoleon was an interesting character. I have a book on Napoleon. I haven't finished it, but it's that thick. So to my defense, it's a big book. But I have read some about him. And I've always been fascinated about Napoleon because he was an absolute genius. He had a work ethic that was just incredible. He did have a pride problem, that's for sure. But aside from that, he was a pretty amazing figure. He was law and order, justice, mercy. He was loyal to his generals and his confidants. His two biggest problems seem to me anyway to be pride and he wasn't very faithful with respect to the women. He had his girlfriend or whatever, I guess it was his wife technically, but he was with a lot of other women around. So that was his biggest issue. But one thing about Napoleon, which is unique, is that he did believe in justice for everyone. He believed that everybody should be liberated. Bless you. When he went to Italy and captured Italy, he actually broke down all the walls of the ghetto and released the Jews. Bless you. Released all the Jews, set all the Jewish people free, and granted them full citizenship. Now, Napoleon expected loyalty in return. So he expected the Jewish people to be loyal French citizens and so on. And for the most part, that was the case. He set them free. And Napoleon even went to the Holy Land and tried to conquer the Holy Land to be a place for the Jews. He wasn't trying to conquer the Holy Land to be part of his empire. He was actually trying to bring it back for the Jewish people. So he started this, he actually invaded at Akko, which means acre in English. Akko, if you look at a map of Israel, you'll see Haifa. And Haifa, there's a bay there. On the other side of the bay is the city of Akko. Haifa and Akko kind of are on two sides of the bay. Akko is the oldest seaport in human history. It's 5,000 years old, this seaport. And so he tried to invade there, and his plan ultimately failed, but that's where his invasion force landed. So my wife and I have spent twice, we've spent a couple of weeks in Akko. There was a house there that we were able to rent, and we went from there to tour the land. And anyway, Akko is a pretty interesting place. But the apartment we were staying in, where we parked our car, right there is this basically city park, and it's kind of a hill. And it's actually not a hill, it's called a tell in Hebrew. And a tell is where basically you've had a civilization, and then a civilization on top of that, and a civilization on top of that, and a civilization on top of that, and a civilization on top of that, until you have like a hill. You know, Israel is one of those unique places where there's thousands and thousands of years of human history, and you can walk around and be sitting on a 3,000-year-old fallen over pillar, where in America we would have that thing taped off and under plexiglass. Well, you can sit on that and eat a sandwich and just enjoy the thing. Go, look, this 3,000-year-old pillar. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's just an amazing place. So we go out for walking on this tell. It turns out this tell is where Ahab and Jezebel, this is where Jezebel was born in Akko, and this is where her priests would worship and everything on this tell. And so we had a friend of ours who lived in Haifa, and he took us, he said the place where they say Elijah's cave is just a tourist site. That's not really Elijah's cave. So he drove us around the backside of Mount Carmel through this no man's land. It's a beautiful drive, but it's this no man's land area. And we ended up on this spot way off the beaten path. There's an ancient Catholic monastery right here. And off to the side, overlooking this cliff, is where the locals say Elijah called down fire from heaven. And the reason the mosque, or not the mosque, but the reason the monastery is there is because that's where the ancient Catholics believed it happened too. So it's all way off the beaten path. But the cool thing is, when you're standing in the spot where allegedly he called down fire from heaven, it overlooks the Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon, and you can see Akko over there. And you can see where the 450 prophets of Baal would have walked across the Jezreel Valley coming to him. He would have seen him. And then you can see that the Mediterranean Sea is right there too. So you would have seen the whole Mediterranean Sea. When it says he looked toward the sea and it's all a cloud like a man's hand. So it's pretty cool. It's all that kind of stuff. So anyway, at the top of this tell is a statue to Napoleon. It's Napoleon on a horse. And the reason it's there is because the Jewish people recognize that he at least tried to free the Holy Land for the Jewish people. So you have this situation with Napoleon where everybody seems to kind of hate Napoleon as being this dictator, this kind of arrogant leader, this self-made emperor. He wasn't French. He couldn't really speak French very well. He's kind of like me, actually. He couldn't speak French very well, but he's a really remarkable person. But I've always found it fascinating that everybody hates Napoleon, and yet he's the one European leader who actually gave the most freedom to the Jewish people. Now, it was a short-lived freedom because Napoleon didn't reign for very long. I believe something to the effect of about 10 or 15 years. But he was kind of the precursor for freedom for the Jewish people. It came at the hands of Napoleon. So just something worth mentioning. I'm still learning more about Napoleon and his time period. To me, it's fascinating how you can have the French Revolution in 1789, and then within really a decade, you have an emperor of France. How do you go from freedom, copying the Americas, to now an emperor? I don't know, but in a short one at that. But in any case. So just to kind of wrap some things up, chapter 10 is a good chapter. We're not going to really get into that in today's class. We'll leave that for y'all to kind of, it talks more about blood libels and different things that were going on in the late 1800s the mid 1800s to the late 1800s. This happens to be the time period of the American Civil War as well, but that's neither here nor there. It gets into more propaganda and so on. But in that time period, we see, it says here, I highlighted, rightly or wrongly, the Jews have the terrifying and inconceivable reputation of sacrificing a Christian on their Passover and distributing the blood to their core religionists in the region. And all of this is happening in 1840. So we see that in the 1840s, what we thought maybe had been a medieval mindset about Jews, in the 1840s is now raising its ugly head once again. And please don't think that there's not people in the world today that don't think that we Jews sacrifice Christian children and use their blood to make matzah. I guarantee you there's people in Europe and in the Middle East and probably in the Far East who think that we do just that. And probably will always think that. There's people that have all kinds of strange ideas about Jewish people and what we believe and what we practice. So when you're out and about, I guess in the back of your mind anyway, that's something interesting to know, that people think all kinds of things. There's all kinds of urban legends about Jews and what they believe. And I'm sure that many of you probably have many interesting stories to tell about what you've already run into when people ask you about your faith and so on. Just like my friend one time who came into my house. He knew I was a believer in Messiah. He came into my house. He saw all of the menorah and everything, all the different things we have in our house. And this has been a number of years ago. But he said, I thought you believed in Messiah. And I said, I do. He said, but you're Jewish? And I said, well, yes. He said, but y'all killed Christ. And of course, I looked at him and I thought, wow, that's an anti-Semitic thing to say, and you're in my house. But I knew that he didn't know what he was saying. He was just, it's like the worst thing you could say, you know. But the good thing about that conversation is it led to enlightenment for him. But that kind of stuff, I was eating dinner with a relative one time on my mother's side who they themselves are also Jewish by blood, but they're not living the life. They don't accept it yet or whatever. We're eating dinner. And the relative says, well, I know, I just try to Jew him down. And we just looked up at it, and they looked at me, and they was like, I shouldn't say that, should I? I'm like, no. No, you shouldn't say that, you know. So anyway, any questions about what we shared or thoughts or comments on what we shared today? No? Baruch Hashem. Well, I hope it's been helpful information. We'll continue next week, week 6, and Bezrat Hashem, I'll bring some quotes from the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. I hope that'll be interesting as well. We'll go back in time a little bit and talk about that. Yes. Go ahead. Uh-huh.
At work, you know, I've been sharing with them the different diets that started to change over the years.
Okay.
They know that I eat officially kosher now.
Right.
But prior to this, though, there would be times where we would stay late, have to work like till 9 or 10 or 11 beyond normal business hours, and they would get pizza.
Right. Sure.
And so I say, I'll just have ground beef and jalapeno and pineapple. And when they first heard that, they're like, that's strange. And then we'll get it, and they'll get like the largest pizza size for everybody's preference. And my pizza will be the one that I gotta go grab 3 pieces, or else I'm not getting any more.
Right. They'll take the pizza you ordered. Right.
They'll take my pizza.
Right.
Like, that's awesome. Like, they never even had ground beef, pineapple, and whatever. But I haven't ordered that since I've been coming here. I'm just saying that
I understand.
when I was doing that, like, even when I thought I was eating kosher or somewhat kosher, they were still like pouncing on the food
Exactly.
I ordered because I don't know. And they criticized it and then they ate it all.
We do things. I know. My wife and I do things differently nowadays. We just bring food with us normally when we go to a relative's house. But I had a relative, and they were having this has been a number of years ago. They were having a get-together, and it was going to involve pizza. And so my wife and I were thinking, well, what do we do? What do we do? And so we just said to our relative, we says, you know what? For us, just do like a veggie-only pizza. No meat, and certainly no ham. Now nowadays we do it differently, but back then that was our compromise. So we show up at the relative's house, we're ready to have a good time with everybody and just enjoy everybody's company. And my relative says, "I got you, and it has vegetables, but I went ahead and got Canadian bacon. Now that's not ham, right?" and they were so clueless about. And I said that is Canadian bacon is ham. They're like, it is? Like, yeah. Right. So we had chips and salsa. So, there you go. But,
I started bringing my own food.
right,
My
bring your own.
grandkids are older, and the last time I did that, I said, I want to share a meal with y'all, so I'll just bring my own. And when I got there and they were looking at my plate, they're like, what's wrong with our food?
Right.
Remind them. And then when I started helping with the dishes, my granddad said, you didn't eat my food, you're not cleaning my dishes.
Oh, okay.
I'm not trying to be
Right.
problematic.
But and even in traditional settings, when they talk about to people about conversion in a traditional synagogue, these are not problems that are unique to Lapid. This is one of those things that rabbis talk with the converts about, that you have one side of your family that obviously is not Jewish, and then you have this new side of your family that is, and just understand that there is potential problems. My wife and I are blessed that our immediate family, even though they're not practicing, they are on board, and so they work with us. Now my aunts and uncles beyond that first level, no, they don't even talk to us, much less eat with us. But that's okay. It's just one of those things, and it is interesting. There is an interesting thing about food. I think when it comes down to it, some of this stuff is anti-Semitic, of course. It comes from that spirit. Some of it also is just, especially if they're believers, in their soul, they're convicted. And they, instead of dealing with that conviction with Hashem and praying about it and studying it out, they take it out on you. It's kind of like the person that I was saying that was getting on to one of our people that your conversion is not legitimate. I said, really the sad thing is that person ultimately, they're being used because they have a hurt and they don't feel worthy, or they feel they've got a hole in their heart. So instead of trying to elevate to your level and trying to figure out how they can heal that hurt and pursue that, they're trying to pull you down back into their pain again. Because misery, there's the saying, misery enjoys company, right? This is why we've got to make an effort that when we hear somebody is having good news, they've got the promotion, or they got the new car, or they got the new house, we've got to rejoice with them and be careful not to say, well, how come I don't have a new car? How come I don't have a new house? Which is a natural fleshly response sometimes. But when we rejoice with them, Hashem says, okay, great, now you get the new car and the new house, or whatever. So anyway, it's just, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. Baruch Hashem. All right, well, bless y'all. Thank you so much for joining us today. Look forward to next week.